900 companies, $47 billion. Those are not projections. Those are not estimates from a think tank with a political position to defend. Those are numbers from the Internal Revenue Service of the United States federal government, which collects the most comprehensive and honest record of where money actually sits and where it actually goes of any institution in this country. The IRS migration data, released in May 2026, documented that between 2020 and 2024 alone, nearly 900 companies packed up their operations and left New York State, taking with them an estimated $47 billion in income that will never again appear on a New York tax return. Florida received the largest share. Texas followed. North Carolina was third. And in Albany and at City Hall, the officials who presided over every policy decision that compounded into this outcome are now preparing to add a millionaire's tax on top of the existing structure that produced those numbers. I want to walk you through exactly what $47 billion leaving a state actually means in practice, because this is one of those situations where the headline number is so large that it can lose its human weight if you read it too quickly and move on. And in my experience, the numbers that people move past the quickest are often the ones that matter the most. Let me start with what New York was before the decade that produced these numbers, because understanding the foundation makes the erosion visible in a way that the headline data alone cannot. New York City was not simply a large economy. It was the financial capital of the world. Not a financial capital, the financial capital. The concentration of banking, asset management, private equity, hedge funds, insurance, and professional services that existed in the 5 boroughs of New York City was without parallel anywhere on earth for decades. Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, the names that define global finance were New York names. And the personal wealth generated by the people running those institutions and the corporate tax revenue generated by the institutions themselves funded an enormous public infrastructure of schools, hospitals, transit, cultural institutions, and social services that made New York City one of the great human achievements of the 20th century. All of that was built on a tax base that was always thinner than it appeared, because it was never broadly distributed. The top 1% of New York City's taxpayers generate more than 40% of the entire city's income tax revenue. When those taxpayers make decisions about where to live and where to operate, the mathematical consequences for the budget are immediate, compounding, and not easily replaced by redistributing the burden to people who were never generating enough income to absorb it. Now let me give you the full scope of what is happening to that tax base right now, and why the IRS migration numbers represent only the visible surface of a deeper structural shift. Between 2020 and 2024, nearly 900 companies and $47 billion in income left New York. But those figures capture only what is already documented in final tax filings from completed tax years. They do not capture the decisions being made in 2025 and 2026 in response to Mayor Mamdani's proposed tax agenda. They do not capture Apollo Global Management, which manages $900 billion in assets and announced in the spring of 2026 that it intends to establish a second headquarters in Florida or Texas with up to 1,000 future employees assigned to that new location. The company's statement was precise and worth reading carefully. It said, New York does not have a monopoly on talent, and that most of Apollo's future growth is expected to happen at the new headquarters outside New York, not in Manhattan. That is not a company saying it is keeping New York as its equal partner. That is a company saying New York will be where the history is, and Florida or Texas will be where the future gets built. And when a company with $900 billion under management makes that declaration publicly, in writing, every other firm watching it process the same information, will notice and adjust its own calculations accordingly. They always do. The Citadel story sits at the center of this pattern in a way that deserves its own examination, because the sequence of events is unusually visible and unusually well documented. Mayor Mamdani stood on a public sidewalk on tax day and broadcast the home address of Ken Griffin, the founder and chief executive of Citadel, while announcing a new tax on luxury properties. Griffin called it a personal attack. He called it a profound lack of judgment. His chief operating officer, Gerald Beeson, wrote to Citadel employees about a planned 62-story, 1.9 million square foot skyscraper development at 350 Park Avenue, a project that would represent more than $6 billion in private investment in New York City's built environment and would create 6,000 high-paying construction jobs and support 15,000 permanent positions in Midtown. Beeson wrote the phrase, "if we move forward." He did not write when we move forward. He wrote if. And Griffin told CNBC directly that Citadel would add far more jobs in Miami over the next decade as an immediate and direct consequence of the mayor's decision to post that video. Griffin did not come to New York from a place of abstract loyalty. He moved Citadel out of Chicago after naming crime and taxes and political dysfunction as his explicit reasons. He made the same calculation once before and has already built in Miami the foundation for what comes next. He is not bluffing. He has demonstrated in one city exactly what he will do in another if the conditions require it. Now let me be honest about the complete picture, because I have never respected analysis that hides the parts that complicate the narrative. Manhattan's commercial real estate market in the first quarter of 2026 showed leasing activity up, vacancy rates declining, and rents increasing in top-tier buildings. American Express announced plans for a new headquarters building. AI companies are competing aggressively for premium office space. J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs and several other major institutions continue to maintain significant presences and are signing long-term leases. These are real data points, and they belong in any honest accounting of where New York sits today. A city with New York's concentration of infrastructure, talent, institutional relationships, and cultural capital does not hollow out in a single quarter or even a single mayoral term. That is not how cities of this scale change. What changes first, and what is already clearly changing, is the direction of the gravity. Where does future growth go? Where do the next 1,000 hires get placed? Where does the $900 billion firm route its expansion? Those decisions do not appear in current real estate occupancy data. They appear in headcount reports 2 or 3 years from now, by which point the trend is visible and the options for reversing it have narrowed considerably. J.P. Morgan Chase already employs more people in Texas than in New York. J.P. Morgan's CEO, Jamie Dimon, wrote in his 2026 annual letter to shareholders that this trend will likely continue. The New York headquarters address stays. The growth goes to Dallas. That is what a slow departure looks like before the numbers make it undeniable. The arithmetic underneath New York's fiscal position makes this moment particularly consequential. Mayor Mamdani's administration entered office with a projected budget deficit of $5.4 billion over 2 years. To close that gap, the mayor proposed raising the top city income tax rate from 3.9% to 5.9% and raising the corporate tax rate from 7.5% to 11.5%, which would make New York City's corporate rate the highest in the nation, matching New Jersey. Combined with the state's existing 10.9% income tax on top earners, New York City's wealthiest residents would face a combined income tax approaching 17%, the highest in the United States by a margin large enough to constitute a structurally different calculation for any person or company with real choices about where to be. Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson, watching this unfold from a city that has been positioning itself as Wall Street South, told reporters early in 2026 that what was already a trickle of financial firms leaving New York was going to turn into a flood and potentially an avalanche. Relocation attorneys in Florida reported that calls from New York companies jumped between 5 and 10 times in the months following Mamdani's election. Palm Beach County has been formally marketing itself as Wall Street South, with aggressive outreach to New York financial institutions. Now think carefully about the people who absorbed the consequences of this trend, who had nothing to do with producing it. The 900 companies that left between 2020 and 2024 were not just executive suites and hedge fund offices. They were the support staff, the operations teams, the technology departments, the administrative functions that employed thousands of people who built careers inside those organizations over many years. They were the restaurants within walking distance of corporate offices that built their lunch business around reliable daily traffic. They were the dry cleaners, the car services, the local retailers whose customer base was defined by the proximity of those companies. They were the school districts, funded by property taxes, paid by employees who could afford to own homes in New York because those jobs existed there. When a company routes its next 1,000 hires to Miami instead of Manhattan, not a single headline gets written about the building in Midtown that does not fill the way it would have, or the local sandwich shop that does not need a second counter person, or the apartment that does not get rented because the person who would have rented it is living in Fort Lauderdale instead. The visible departure is the CEO announcing a second headquarters. The invisible departure is everything downstream of that decision, compounding across many years in directions that never reach the financial pages. The IRS does not record intentions, it records outcomes. And the outcome it recorded for New York between 2020 and 2024 was 900 companies and $47 billion choosing to build their next chapter somewhere else. The politicians who governed during those years expressed consistent confidence that New York's advantages were irreplaceable, that the talent concentration was too valuable to leave, that the network effects of being in the financial capital of the world would always outweigh any cost differential. They were wrong often enough, and specifically enough, that the IRS eventually produced a document that does not care about confidence or political positioning. It just records where the money went. And right now, as new policies are being layered on top of the structure that produced those numbers, the next IRS data set is already being assembled in the tax returns of companies and individuals making decisions today about where their next chapter gets written. That document will arrive in a few years, and it will not ask anyone in Albany or at City Hall for a comment before it tells the truth. The numbers always tell the truth. They just wait until enough of them have accumulated to make the story impossible to explain away.